Good morning. With Fate of the Vault coming to a close, I tried my hand at making a concoction build to see where they sit in the sandbox, mainly to get myself more familiar with the skills to better understand any changes the developers would possibly make to concoctions in the next league. But with it being a bit delayed, I decided to push this forward in my schedule. For this video, I'm going to examine the flaws surrounding concoctions and try to identify the core identities for this category of skill. Think of it as an analysis, but also a wishlist. While I may be incorrect in some aspects, like misremembering or lack of knowledge and limited experience in game design, I'll try to be as thorough to the best of my abilities. Concoctions are vials of conspicuous fluids that have varying quirks which set them apart. Their intended roles are likely to fit a more secondary role, assisting your primary skills to work as setup or as payoff. Though, with them being Ascendancy skills, they lack the needed oomph to be considered as such. Besides, why would someone ever consider using them as a primary skill if they don't provide that opportunity? From the current selection, it's easy to see that not all concoctions are equal, reason being that they are unfinished. While some have a hint of flavor, others are extremely bland. But before I dissect them, we need to widen our scope to look at other mechanics surrounding them to get a better idea where they fit in. Since concoctions are Ascendancy skills and are part of a multi-choice node, they each have to fit their own niche and appeal to a designated fantasy. By already being inside a niche, that being the Pathfinder Ascendancy, they don't see that much adoption, even if they would fit the user's build. The driving force is that they are undesirable in many cases, often being overshadowed by other options due to the effort needed to make them work, or just a general lack of luster. As these skills are tied to an Ascendancy, they are subject to the standard Ascendancy rules. 1. Being unmodifiable by currencies, and 2. Scaling the level and number of sockets according to the player's level. Being unmodifiable by currencies removes a vector of player agency, making these skills less adaptable to the player and forces the player to adapt to it, oftentimes unwillingly. While the system might free up some early game dependencies, scaling becomes rather difficult later on. However, a major problem the developers then face is, what if the player unspecs from it, which would cause the skill to lose all of its properties? And thinking about it in this way, I understand why they went with the system, even if I'm not a big fan of it. So instead, I would hope to see improvements to the socket thresholds for Ascendancy skills in general, not just concoctions. On top of that, it would be great if they allowed these skills to scale their quality according to the player character level, since adding quality to these skills is rather limited. The progression for concoctions are honestly quite rough, and I'm not just talking about the moment you get access to them. I won't be going over the exact act-by-act progression, but I'll go over the primary details. There are a multitude of systems that concoctions interact with, however some of these seem to be underdeveloped. Concoctions require mana Flask Charges in order to be used, and I'll give credit where it's due, I actually love the concept of this mechanic. But because I love it, I decided to analyze it, and after continuous testing, I noticed that my mana flask wasn't filling as consistently as it should. By emptying and re-equipping my mana flask, I'm able to find that for some reason, flasks don't gain a set amount of charges per second, and instead gain a random assortment. I'm not sure why, and I theorize that there might be something wrong with the formula. And while on this topic, even if we would get the correct amount per second, the notables and modifiers that give mana flask charges per second do not provide enough benefit for the investment they require, most notably on the passive tree and in the early game. I could talk about how flasks are quite plain and boring, and if you intend to scale them, how they barely provide any other benefit beyond life and mana. But that's the topic for a different video. Speaking of scaling, scaling into late game reveals several scalers that struggle due to how they were designed. It's not just damage values, but rather due to the restrictive nature of concoctions and various other systems. Being unarmed already has a few setbacks. 1. You don't have a weapon. Despite being the only reason, it has a compounding effect across few vectors. Since concoctions don't have access to weapons, their stats are predetermined. I don't find this to be a problem, however, as having fixed stats makes them a reliable skill, and if need be, they can be more easily balanced by the developers. But because of their rigidness, they tend to slack behind other skills that inherit the stats from weapons, as weapons tend to be more variant in their stat values. When it comes to affixes or modifiers that adds effects or adjust base stats, Concoctions do not have that many options readily available, whereas with weapons you can pretty easily get modifiers that directly boost your skill's effectiveness. With concoctions you need to get them from other sources. With limited damage scaling effects, the job falls on your other gear in order to pick up the slack, relying on your gloves, rings, amulet, and offhand shield to fill in the gaps. In Path of Exile 1, concoctions would scale from the flask types you used, with poisonous concoction scaling its damage from your flask's total recovery amount. By implementing a similar system, it would both encourage scaling your flask's effectiveness and take the stress off of your gear, allowing you to spec further into defenses or magic find if you so desire. An additional consideration is allowing players to use scepters in their offhand. This would provide a damage option alongside the established defensive option for players to consider, opening even more avenues. I could go on about the dominance of plus to skill levels, but I already know it's a widely discussed topic, so I'll refrain from adding coal to the forest fire. Moving on from weapons, I guess not, as there are persistent skills that could help in scaling concoctions, but due to martial weapon requirements, you can't use them. And yes, I'm talking about heralds. There's a herald for each concoction, outside of Sig, which could help greatly in various aspects, though mainly in clearing capabilities, which concoctions desperately need. One thing to note is that you can allocate Hollow Palm technique to count as holding a quarterstaff, though it does not provide further benefit. Using this keystone allows you to run heralds with concoctions, however I'll still argue that we shouldn't need to use this keystone in order to fix a fundamental flaw. Heralds being able to work with unarmed skills would help move away from weapon superiority, and possibly open the door to future unarmed builds. I know many people would prefer that. Now, moving on from weapons, the very nature of how concoction projectiles are designed limits the amount of systems it can interact with. Since the vials break on impact, behavioral effects like split, fork, chain, and pierce don't work on them, and having checked, chaining from terrain doesn't work either. While it is completely understandable that the developers don't want a repeat of poisonous concoction of bouncing, I'd still argue that PCOB shows how beneficial such a behavioral effect is for this type of skill, although it would be better if a different effect was introduced for each of these individual skills that fit the thematic background of each element, rather than copying the bouncing mechanic. Which brings us to the individual skills. As these are Ascendancy skills, I'd want to look at other Ascendancy skills to gauge how detailed they should be, as designing from a framework allows us to fit something into an existing frame. For obvious reasons, I'll be handpicking these examples. The four are as follows: Elemental Expression, Demon Form, Ritual Sacrifice, and the Barriers. Each of these are very different in their designs and application, with Elemental Expression and the Barriers being related to concoctions in subtle ways, but the other two having more noticeable differences. First, what are Ascendancy skills intended to do? These skills are designed to further emphasize the identity and personality of the Ascendancy. They each fill a role in the Ascendancy's kit that allows the player to further specialize into their respective character personality. They provide a meaningful and interesting alternative that fundamentally alters how the player interacts with their character and playstyle. Secondly, how do each of these affect the player's interaction with their character's build? 1. They add effects to the player's existing skills, some in the form of triggered spells, often depending on which element or stat distribution the character has. 2. Altering the very fundamentals of how their skill functions, replacing a key system with something that the player then has to adapt to. 3. Unlocking an additional system that works outside of their skills that alter their character's behavior, usually with added buffs or numerous modifiers. 4. Providing sets of abilities that the player can use alongside their other skills, with these abilities having their own interactions and sometimes comboing with other skills. With these laid out, we can see that the Ascendancy skills are intended to be rather large gameplay altering choices that further push a player into their respective playstyle and character identity. However, when comparing concoctions to what these other Ascendancies offer, you can easily see how they don't provide the meaningful push to entice people to use them. But with all that said, how can you make these skills more enticing to the average player, or just give them a desired personality that emphasizes the Ascendancy's theme? Concoctions are framed as vials filled with liquids and oddities found out in the wilderness. With the World of Ray class being a messed up and fantastical landscape, you'd expect stuff found out in the wilderness to be chaotic and out there. However, that fundamental feeling is missing from Concoctions. Alongside that, Pathfinder now has the added trait of finding her way to other sides of the passive tree, which means that Concoctions can draw inspiration from other parts of the tree, to add flavor. So, here are my perceived analysis of each. Fulminating Concoction is rather boring, to put it plainly. Just making a loud noise and applying a more effective shock isn't exactly fulminating. As lightning skills tend to be more on the zappy, electrocuting, or chaining variety in terms of design, fulminating feels quite barren of interesting possible interactions and theme, leading to few people even wanting to try it, me included. It's missing the feeling of it being a lightning skill, and no matter how potent you make the shock effect, it will still lack that. But how do you go about filling that void? The first step is to identify that it is a lightning skill, from which we can pull several types of lightning-related themes, and then compare it to other skills that are available. Doing so, it is evident that we should refrain from making another arcing or chaining skill, and honestly, there's a lot more available in the lightning design space. For instance, we can look at electricity. It is a natural component that is closely related to static and discharges, and since fulminating means exploding in a violent manner, we can tie these together to form an unstable connection, quite literally. When a player would throw Fulminating Concoction into a group of enemies and the breaking vial shocks these enemies, it would link the affected targets through lightning tendrils. If any hit would deal damage to one of these targets, that damage will then be shared to other linked enemies based on the shock magnitude. However, these tendrils are unstable, and enough damage is dealt, or the connection is severed by killing the target, the tendrils will discharge, dealing damage to the connected enemies and causing a chain reaction. If you're wondering about single target damage, fret not, as dealing enough damage will cause built-up static to discharge violently, dealing damage to the affected target. By drawing from different aspects of the lightning element, we can design a more violent reaction and connect it to the system that could use some love. Sure, link skills are coming eventually. I wanted to like Explosive Concoction. The fantasy of throwing an increasing amount of vials at my enemies was enticing, giving me the idea that I was handling very angry and explosive bees that were attracted to the flames of my burning enemies. That however did not come to fruition. Requiring enemies to be ignited to then be able to throw additional bottles doesn't work in practice, as ignite proliferation isn't in the greatest spot, nor does it work if the enemy is dead. Never mind the limited single target capabilities. The fantasy of lobbing an increasing amount of projectiles is great, however, and should be expanded on. Perhaps allowing the player to siphon embers from nearby ignited enemies and charred corpses to throw additional projectiles based on the amount of ember stacks the player has. And to take it further, these projectiles could release a cluster of sub-munitions on impact, improving its range coverage and emphasizing the multiplying fantasy. That way we still keep the ignited requirement, but loosen the strictness and push the identity further. The idea of handling angry and explosive bees still entices me. Though there's also the possibility to rather pivot to a more napalm approach, with burning ground hazards that inflict flammability beyond the limit and cause enemies to detonate after dying or reaching a certain threshold of flammability. Or a mix. There's always that. Shattering Concoction has an inverse identity, since it's primarily used for coating enemies in ice rather than shattering them. That might be something to consider and not outright discard. Right now, all Shattering Concoction does is apply an exposure effect and freeze primed enemies. Once more, really underwhelming. But there are not that many ice skills that effectively freeze a large group of enemies, so it could pivot to a coating identity, yet at the other end we don't have many freeze consuming skills, so we could go with a shattering variant. It could, A, stick to enemies when thrown, with which it will radiate an aura that applies exposure to surrounding enemies. Over time, it will build up to a violent burst of cold damage in a large radius to cause a massive freeze buildup and deal more damage to frozen targets. Or B, allow you to go bowling. More specifically, throwing a fastball to shatter any frozen targets or ice crystals in its radius, and dealing improved damage based on the freeze duration and crystal life. I'm leaning more to the latter, but the former is cool as well. It mostly depends on which feels better to play and how much it complements the thematic identity of the cold element. Next up is acidic. Not sure how consuming poison stacks to cause a deadly fart cloud is acidic, as acid is usually associated with the dissolving of materials rather than toxic fumes. Well, my understanding anyway. That's more a toxic personality that fits the plague bearer rather than a bottle of fluid. If we strip acidic to its base form, what are we left with? A physical damage concoction with green coloration. It can work with both bleed and poison, but with poison being the only option as bleeding concoction already exists. I'll refrain from suggesting poisonous concoction because I would rather have something different and more interesting. If we were to work with a name, the concoction could coat enemies in acid upon breaking, eroding their armor and increasing the chaos damage they take. If the enemy dies while affected by a chaos damage over time effect / ailment, and the effect can spread, the acid coating would spread along with it. By taking inspiration from Contagion, we apply a more viral nature to the effect while making it compatible with Contagion itself. Though in hindsight, it might make thematic sense, and the distinctive nature of dissolving enemies' defenses does set it apart, but it still doesn't feel interesting. So how about combining the dissolving part of my version with the bursting part of the current version? When the acid coating dissolves an enemy's armor and it breaks, the buildup of gases will trigger a large burst that damages it and nearby enemies. Then, since its armor is all mushy, if enough time passes or the enemy dies while coated, the armor will begin to form an acid pool beneath it, hindering enemies and dealing hazard poison damage over time. The last part notably not applying a poison ailment, but still dealing poison damage. There are surely many other ways to go about this, as I'm not entirely certain what to do with acidic concoction. Though this version feels much more interesting thematically and has a greater foundation to build off of. And with how much time I spent thinking about this one skill, I'd rather move on. At last, Bleeding Concoction. I'll be honest and say that I'm looking forward to trying this one next league, even if it might not get any changes. Bleed seems to be getting much more fleshed out with each league, and that excites me. However, even with that, I still find that Bleeding Concoction lacks personality. While aggravating bleed might interact with other mechanics in a more direct way, it could rather have built-in effects that makes it more interesting. The bottle is made of glass, and contains a red liquid, though I doubt the liquid is what makes enemies bleed in this case. So, what if the glass from the concoction would lacerate enemies in its radius, and lodge into their bodies for a duration? Remember that red liquid? While enemies are covered in this liquid, it will slither across their skin and tug intermittently at the lodged pieces of glass, dealing periodic damage to them. If the enemy is bleeding, these shards will deal more damage based on the blood loss the enemy has accumulated. And we don't stop there. If the duration of the effect wears off, or the enemy dies while it has glass shards lodged into it, the shards will drop to the ground, and while on the ground, the red liquid will slowly drag itself and the shards closer to the player, with the intensity increasing based on proximity. Once the player is close enough, the fallen shards attach to the player, and they gain a stack of shard layering, which can stack multiple times. With a stack of shard layering, any projectile the player then throws or fires will release additional shards on impact that splits to nearby enemies. These additional shards won't lodge into enemies, but can still apply other normal effects. You can probably hear that I enjoy designing this skill, but there's always a chance I over-designed it. I've recently gained a greater appreciation for blood magic and based the concept of the identity on the wall, which I hope came across in my explanation. And that is the end. Kinda rushed this since I wanted to get this out before the reveal on the 7th of May. Probably failed, but oh well. Some of the redesigns might be undercooked, but I still enjoy the idea of potentially playing these redesigns, though they might need some fine-tuning. I really like concoctions. The Alchemist Fantasy has always been one of my favorites, and I want to see concoctions be special in their own right. They've been underwhelming for some time now. If the developers do change concoctions in 0.5 in a significant way, they'll likely hold off on changing them again for 0.6 or 1.0 if it goes straight to release. If that's the case, then I'll probably make a follow-up, but not as in-depth, mainly going over the changes. For other topics like flasks, as mentioned during the video, I'll talk about them more in-depth in a separate video. For now, I'll probably just go play Nier Automata while I wait for the reveal. Been meaning to do that for some time now. Stay sane. Until next time.